Welcome to Preparing for AI, the AI podcast for everybody, with your hosts Jimmy Rhodes and me, Matt Cartwright. We explore the human and social impacts of AI, looking at the impact on jobs, AI and sustainability, and most importantly, the urgent need for safe development of AI, governance and alignment. Salt air and the rust on your door. I never needed anything more. Whispers of Are You Sure? Never have I ever before. Welcome to Preparing for AI, the AI podcast for
everybody.
With me, Matt Cartwright, and
me, Jimmy Rhodes.
Well, this week we are, as we always say, going to do something slightly different, but this will be the first of our kind of monthly roundup episodes. So we're aiming every month to have one episode like this where it'll be just me and Jimmy talking about what's gone on the last month in the kind of AI landscape, chewing the fat, shooting the breeze, and kind of getting off our chest anything that we want to talk about from that month in AI. So this week, we're going to start off with probably the biggest story was the release of the new Llama models. So we're going to start off with a bit of a chat about open sourced and closed source AI models, and I will let Jimmy kick this one off.
Thanks, Matt. So Meta, interestingly, maybe slightly confusingly, is open sourcing all of their models. We've talked a little bit about open source before, but for anyone who didn't hear that, or for anyone who wants a better understanding of it, basically Meta and other companies are open sourcing, so like making freely available all of the information, all of the weights and information behind their models, so that anyone can run them on their own hardware, as opposed to closed source offerings from companies like OpenAI or Anthropic with Claude and ChatGPT. So it's really interesting because, as I say, it's not something you would necessarily expect from a company like Meta. All the other big tech companies are basically running closed source models, whereas Meta have decided that their approach is going to be, they're spending a lot of money on this stuff. So their approach is they're going to be training up these models and then effectively giving them away so people can run them on their own hardware. And I actually have been running the latest Meta model, one of the smaller models, on my own computer, which is fantastic. So that's completely my data, my privacy. I can run it on my own computer. It's not going into the cloud anywhere. And it's quite exciting. The other exciting thing about this, and the sort of the reason it's big news, is that the Frontier model, which is a 450 billion parameter model, which you definitely can't run on.
So we should probably say this is not the one you've downloaded to your local computer, because we joked about you having 20,000 GPUs in the back, but you'd sort of need something close to that to run the new massive model on your own network. It would need to be, wouldn't it?
Yeah, totally. So I'm running the 7 billion parameter model. I don't think I could even run the one above that. Oh, I think it's 8 billion parameter. I don't think I could even run the 70 billion parameter model, which is the middle one. But the 450 billion parameter model is something that it gets run on enterprise type equipment. But the cool thing about it is that it's neck and neck with ChatGPT and like frontier closed source models like ChatGPT 4.0 and Claude 3.5 Sonnet. So it's actually massively closed the gap. And to be honest, there's the frontier closed source models are a little bit better, but you're kind of splitting hairs at this point. Basically, the open source stuff is now just as good as the closed source stuff, and actually must have OpenAI and companies like Anthropic quaking in their boots a little bit.
I think a question at this point that I wanted to ask you, I sort of know the answer to this, but I don't fully 100% understand. But when we say they are close to or better, what do we mean by that? Because the question I get asked a lot by people is, oh, well, ChatGPT is the best one, isn't it? And I say, well, it's fine for what you use it for. Actually, what do you mean by the best one? But when you say that, the frontier models, actually Llama is as good as the frontier models, or we say, Sonnet 3.5 has now bypassed 4.0 or whatever, what are we talking about when we say a model is now better or as good as?
So there are a standard set of tests that are run on AIs every time a new AI is released, and they involve maths, language ability, a bunch of different capabilities that test the abilities of large language models. And without going into the scoring and all the rest of it, basically they're very close now. So the latest model, so previously the top performing model on all those tests was ChatGPT 4, and then Sonnet 3.5 came out, and Sonnet 3.5 beat ChatGPT, which is why we say that at the moment, Anthropic's Sonnet model is the best model, like outright. But Llama 450B came very close to both of them on a lot of these tests and did actually outperform them slightly on some of them. And without going into loads of technical details, effectively, I think the main takeaway is the gap has been massively leveled, and they're now so close that you're going to get comparable performance for most things that most people are going to use LLMs for across all of the top models.
So my friend, let's just make up a name, Leopard Hossenfelder. What does he know? So he is a good friend of mine. He's just started using large language models. He mainly asks them questions. He occasionally asks them to help him do some Excel work and to brainstorm things and to, write a presentation. Does it matter to him whether he uses the frontier models? Does it matter to him whether in the background he's got, Llama 2.1, a Mistral model, ChatGPT 3.5, 4.0? I mean, at this point, I guess what I'm trying to ask is for people listening who are not using large language models for anything that requires particularly high capability of maths or, language understanding, does it really matter? Are they going to see the advantage of these models or not?
I would say yes. We're still at the point where if you go back to ChatGPT 3.5, for example, versus ChatGPT 4.0, there is a noticeable difference in ability. So one of the things that I do, for example, at the end of every episode, we have a song, and I don't just get the song lyrics from Suno, which you can do. So you can just put a prompt into Suno and it'll generate lyrics, and then you can generate a song. I think I may have talked about it before. I use Claude 3.5 actually to generate the lyrics, and then I put the lyrics into Suno and put Suno in custom mode, and I tend to find I get better results that way. Personally, I noticed a performance bump with things like generating lyrics between the previous version of Suno and previous versions of ChatGPT, like GPT 3.5, and the newer models. It's just a quality thing. So, for example, outputting songs, it will produce better quality output. It will do something that's more accurate. It might just kind of work better as a song in terms of like the lyrics and the when you put it into Suno, like how that comes out as a song. So it's kind of hard. It's a little bit intangible and hard to put your finger on. But overall, I feel like at the moment, the models are improving enough between generations that it is it is noticeable when you're using the latest models. That being said, I think it's plateauing and it's starting to plateau.
I mean, we've talked about many times now over the last month or so about how we recommend, Anthropic's Claude, and I like the interface to it. And I notice a big bump from 3 to 3.5 on Claude. Also on ChatGPT 3.5 to 4 was massive, but also from 4 to 4.0, there was a difference. But for what I think a lot of people are using large language models at the moment, I'm not trying to be patronizing, it doesn't matter, you use it for what you want, but where a lot of people are using it for quite simple tasks at the moment, I would actually say the best thing for you to use is Grok with a Q.
I agree.
And actually, talking about the Llama models, Grok with a Q has the new Llama models, it has the new Mistral models that it's using in the background. But actually, I think what most people notice when they say better is that they notice it's faster.
Yes.
And actually, Grok with a Q is the fastest, and it has models now which are almost as good as, the best OpenAI and Anthropic and Google models. And therefore, for most people, I would probably say, and you don't need to pay for an account, using it day to day, it's probably my recommendation would be use Grok.
I agree. I mean, I don't know. I suppose in terms of our podcast being the AI podcast for everyone, I would definitely recommend Grok. But I would also say, you can use any of these models on the free tier, and there might be usage limits, there might be rate limits, but they're all going to give you pretty good answers. And I agree, Grok will give you, if you just want a really quick response and you've got some data you want to sort out, you've got a, you want to write, let's say you want to write a letter to the small claims court or something like that because you're upset about a parking ticket. Any of the models will produce you a pretty good first draft that you're going to need to tweak a little bit, but I think there's probably not a lot to choose between them.
So let's get into the weeds a little bit with open source against closed source. And I think there are two sort of really interesting sort of elements or arguments here. The first one and the obvious one is the kind of why. Why would you choose as a company to do open source over closed source? So, I've got some ideas on this, and some of this is not my ideas. Actually, this is things that I've, heard from Mark Zuckerberg, for example. But, what do you think? I mean, let's not go into for the moment what we think are the best, whether we think open source is better or worse, and the sort of security and stuff. We'll move on to that in a bit. But in terms of a business model and in terms of why they're doing it, what's the motivation for an organization to be creating these open source models? And it's not just Meta with Llama, like I said, Mistral's another big one. There are loads of other ones that I don't know the name of. There are plenty of Chinese ones as well. There'll be even more now they've got access to, to play around with the Llama models. But what's the point if you're creating this model to give it away for free?
That's a really good question. I think the best person to ask that is Mark Zuckerberg. If I was to hazard a guess, my view would be that it's disruptive. Which
is what Facebook was.
Exactly. So you're disrupting, and we've seen successful examples of this in the past. So you have Tesla, for example. So Tesla classically open sourced all of their designs for electric motors because there wasn't a big enough market for electric vehicles, and they kind of created the demand by actually open sourcing all their designs and allowing other car companies to compete with them, so that it would actually create competition, create demand, and so this has been done before. Like, it's quite an unusual model, but I think also, as you mentioned, Meta has been a big disruptor in the past, where there's a lot of these examples of these companies where they set up and do things effectively for free, or apparently for free, for a long time, and then it only transpires later what their actual aim was. And there's going to be huge benefits to Facebook as a company to developing frontier AI models, because they'll be able to reinvest that back into Facebook. They'll be able to use it for their algorithms. I presume they'll create, AI generative type functionality within Facebook if they haven't already, which I think they have actually. So like Instagram has some image generation you can do. So there's loads of benefit for them, but they're just not competing in the pure large language model space, I suppose.
This is sort of what Mark Zuckerberg has said. I mean, it's quite a long speech, and it's difficult to know how much to take at face value. I actually kind of believe and buy what he says, and there are a few points in there maybe to raise. One of them is, he's pissed off over many, many years with the way the Apple ecosystem has held back innovation for, Meta, the various sort of apps that they have, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, whatever, by having a limited ecosystem. So you can see how, as a disruptor, and then as someone whose business has been kind of held back in terms of creativity by that, I think that's one part of it. I think another part, which again is something that Mark Zuckerberg has said, is that their business model is not around selling large language models. And AI, as we've talked about many times, the big uses and changes are going to be things that happen in the background and that happen in things that you're already using. And, Google and Apple and Meta were the big three organizations beforehand. I don't think Anthropic's necessarily up there in terms of revenue with them, but the two big organizations in terms of the frontier models at the moment in the last 6 months have been OpenAI with ChatGPT 4.0 and Claude, Opus 3 and Sonnet 3.5. They're not the natural or they're not the natural. They're not the sort of regular big tech titans. And having the best model, we're sort of thinking like, oh, their business model is selling a subscription for 20 quid a month. You know, the B2C side of it is almost kind of irrelevant. It's going to be what happens with enterprise and business and how they make their money out of that. And Microsoft and Google and Apple are all already integrated there. And Meta is already, you know, embedded in all kinds of things that we don't think about. And they're looking at, you know, there was the metaverse, there's the headsets, there's all various things that I think they view AI as being something that underpins other products, and their business model is around all those other things rather than their business model is selling large language models. And that point as well that they'd made about, you know, we had ChatGPT 4 was the best, then ChatGPT 4.0 was the best, then Claude Sonnet 3.5 was the best, soon ChatGPT 5 will be the best, maybe Gemini at some point will finally have the best model. So they're all kind of, you know, vying for top spot. And then you've got open source models. I guess the point is, like, if your business model is going to be based on the fact you've got the number one model, you might only have the number one model for 6 weeks or 3 weeks or actually a day, you know, while the other organizations held back their next model to bring it out. So is that really a viable business? Why if we've got, you know, various other models, if Meta don't make theirs open source but Mistral are making theirs open source, you know, does that give an advantage to Mistral? So I think actually it sort of makes sense even from a commercial point of view that no one's going to win this race by having the best model and then they're just going to carry on being the best. You know, no one can stay ahead. In the same with the kind of US-China race on this is, yeah, China might not completely catch up, but it'll almost catch up. And that an almost good enough will be good enough for most uses. Most uses are not going to need the absolute best frontier model. The military might, you know, and national security might, but actually for most businesses, like, good enough's going to be enough. It's going to be about price and competitivity, and I think also is going to be about being able to have your own closed source model, which you can get an open source model, fine tune it, and then do that with. If you have a closed source model like ChatGPT, even if they're allowing you to have your enterprise model, you don't know at what point they're going to go, oh, we're changing the terms and conditions, or we're now changing our usage policy, and therefore there's a lack of kind of security around that.
Yeah, and I think something that might help understand why we are where we are, where, you know, OpenAI burst onto the scene with ChatGPT, and they had the best model for a while, but now you keep getting this leapfrogging thing that you were referring to, where like different companies, different models keep leapfrogging each other, like almost weekly sometimes, like definitely every month. And part of the reason behind that, just to kind of explain it a little bit, as far as I understand it, like the transformer model itself came out of a research lab. I think it came out of a research lab at Google, and it's been iterated on a little bit. But the actual software, the actual lines of code behind some of these transformer models, it's a very clever algorithm that someone's come up with, but it's actually not that, you know, it's not a huge amount of code. What is required to actually get a good large language model is huge amounts of data and huge amounts of processing power and hardware. And that's why you're seeing these companies leapfrog each other, because it's all about the quality of data and the quantity of data that they've got, and then combining that with like basically massive amounts of hardware. And these models take significant amount of time to train and to fine tune and all the rest of it. So, you know, companies will go quiet for, you know, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, and then you get this update from Facebook where they've actually leapfrogged most of the rest of the models, and next month it might be GPT again.
Hasn't Elon Musk just switched on the biggest sort of super mega computer, you know, transformer model that, and that kind of is your point that it's going to take months, but I think they've just turned that on, haven't they? And therefore are claiming that theirs is going to be number one soon. That's Grok with a K.
Yeah.
Grok with a K?
It's Grok with a K.
Grok with a K. And then you know, just to add one more point on sort of Meta, Mark Zuckerberg again is saying that next year they're going to be number one in terms of the model. And the view seemed to be that it was not a case of like they're going to be number one for a bit, but actually is really confident that theirs is going to be the most powerful model going forward for, you know, I'm not saying forever, but for a kind of significant amount of time at least.
And I assume all that is to do with they've bought up the whatever it is, the NVIDIA chips, the computing resources.
They know what's coming. They've got the supply chain, right?
Yeah.
Because I guess they all know their supply chain now. They must know like a year or two ahead.
Yeah, exactly. So if you know you've got the most hardware, barring like a new improved algorithm or model or bit of software coming out, which is what these things are based on, basically that's it. It's who's got the most computers, who's got the most compute.
Shall we move on to the kind of security element here? Today, as we record this episode, it's the launch of the EU AI Act. So the first sort of major piece of legislation coming in place. I mean, it's also quite ironic as we're talking about Meta, that Meta have announced that they're not going to roll out any of their large language models in the EU because of the EU AI Act. And Apple have also said that they will delay the rollout of the Apple Intelligence stuff, although I've seen that they're now delaying it everywhere. So maybe it doesn't really make any difference. But it's quite a big milestone, really, in terms of governance that's come into place today. It's the first major piece of legislation that covers a lot of things. And so it seems appropriate to talk about the kind of security risks, because the obvious question here for me, and I say for me, I'm sort of saying on behalf of people, I would think, is, okay, open source. So doesn't that mean everyone can get their hands on it? And then immediately it's like, what about terrorists? What about biological weapons? If the frontier models are out there and everyone can pick them up, doesn't that mean that everyone can just start, building super intelligent AIs and creating bioweapons and, launching nuclear bombs? I mean, I kind of jest a little bit, but that would be the immediate reaction. And I know there is a lot of kind of buzz in the US in particular around this and around the national security risk of releasing models. I think in the US, the big national security risk is we're giving China our models. I actually wonder why they always think of China. They never think of North Korea or Russia or anywhere else. It's always China. It's like, China's not that far behind you anyway. If you're worried about giving it away for free, you're not worried about giving it to other countries. But, I digress a little bit. But yeah, what's the argument against that? Or is there an argument against that?
So my thoughts on this, I can't remember whether we've talked about it on the podcast, whether we've talked about AGI and whether we're going to get there. My personal thoughts on this are that the current large language models are slightly more underwhelming in terms of creativity than it was expected. So there seemed to be this expectation that at some point relatively soon, this particular architecture would result in something like AGI, where it would actually be able to have...
Someone had said AGI by September. I don't know if it was Musk. I'm sure someone at the beginning of the year said AGI by September.
Maybe it depends on the definition of AGI, but if you're talking about a model that has a genuine creative thought, I don't think the current architecture is going to get there. So this is all just my opinion, but everything that a large language model spits out, in my opinion, is information that's already out on the web. I saw somebody talking about how underwhelming large language models are in a way. I mean, they're really impressive in what they can do, but they regurgitate information that's already out there. And so if you want to find out how to do any of the things that you're talking about, like national security threat type stuff, it's already out there on the web somewhere. Probably. It's like AI large language models, in my opinion, are not going to come up with like a new biological threat today. Yeah. They might help you get to one with a bit of human creativity, and that's maybe a different conversation. But there was a bit of an anecdote that I heard, and I can't remember where I heard it, but someone was talking about, if you think about large language models, if you go back 15 years, and you had large language models 15 years ago, all of the technology that makes drones work today, as this was the example they used, all the technology that makes drones work today, all the motors, all the AI controls, all of that stuff, the lightweight materials, the whole lot, all of that was developed in the last 15 years. If you went back 15 years and had a large language model 15 years ago, it wouldn't be able to tell you how to make a drone. And this is kind of the thing with it, where like people are expecting miraculous results. People are expecting kind of genuine creativity out of these models, and it doesn't seem to be transpiring. It's just getting really, really good at, like, for example, with the tests we were talking about earlier on, it feels like it's going to get to 100% at some point, but it's probably not going to get to 110%. I know that's kind of a stupid saying, but like, it's
percent
not
of human
yeah
capability is what you mean by percent there.
yeah exactly. So it's for me, they're just, at the moment, they just don't come up with anything genuinely original.
I think a really good example for this, actually, before we sort of dig in a little bit more in the security, but I was talking to someone today, and we were talking about, you know, how ChatGPT works. They've been using ChatGPT, and we were talking about how you can kind of make it change its mind. Or he was talking about how you could challenge it, and I was saying how you can make it change its mind. For example, you know, say act as a bookmaker. Give me the likelihood of Manchester City winning the Premier League next year. Give me the likelihood of the New York Yankees winning the World Series this year, and he'll give you a odds. And then say to it, that sounds overly optimistic, and it will immediately say, you're right. And then it will just give you some odds that are lower. And I did this recently with a statistic around, I can't remember what it was, rates of something. And it gave me a figure, and I was like, oh, but I thought there was lots of this at the moment. Oh, you're right. On that basis, and it gave me a new figure. And I said, that sounds a little bit over the top. On that basis, won't this many people be, you know, in chronic health in the next 6 months? You're right. That does sound over the top. And I said to it, stop correcting yourself. I'm not telling you you're wrong. I'm just saying that's a shocking figure. But it just changed its mind every time. And when you do that, you see how you start to kind of understand how it works in terms of getting that information.
Yeah.
When you say, give me some odds, it doesn't know the odds. It doesn't know what's going to win, because if it knew what was going to win, it would just give you 100% odds of who's going to win. It looks at patterns, and it looks at things that are already there. And you're right, at the moment, it's not anywhere near that level of ability. Going back to the security issue, though, is we're giving these models away for free. At what point, you know, is it too late? And the models are at that point potentially. And if you're right, if it only gets 100%, maybe it's not an issue. But, you know, we are putting out the models for free, and then maybe later on we find out that there's an issue. It feels like, doesn't there come a point that it's like, okay, actually it's fine. And I agree with you. Actually, the current models, I don't think there's an issue with giving them away. Even as someone who, you know, looks at the kind of governance and safety side of it, I don't see an issue with what we're giving away at the moment. But at some point, doesn't there? Can we just give away open source models forever?
I agree. It's definitely something that needs to be looked at, and you know, smarter people than me need to carefully consider it. I also, going back to the point I made before about,
you're supposed to be the expert on this podcast, so
well, smarter people than me in the governance.
Yeah, but there are no smarter people than you on the technical side.
No, not at all. Of course not. Of course,
just
not.
to clarify.
Yeah. I mean, I pretty much came up with the transformer model. But going back to what I was saying before, like, actually, if the algorithm, which the algorithm's open source anyway, like the algorithm for transformers is 100% open source. So if China or Russia or whoever can get hold of enough compute, they can create these models as well. Like, just because Facebook are open sourcing Llama, you know, who's to say whether other countries in a lab somewhere don't have something better? I suspect that in a lab somewhere in the US government has something better.
Of course.
So, you know,
that's why control of chips, and particularly NVIDIA GPUs, is kind of, you know, that
key.
That's the key, isn't it? In the way that control of oil was the priority 30, 40, 50 years ago, the control of chips. And that's, you know, look at the importance of Taiwan, look at the importance of I can't remember the name of the company in the Netherlands that fires the laser that creates the smallest fabs. You know, look at the importance of them, and you realize the whole, you know, global system is kind of being held up by these 2 or 3 pinch points.
Yep.
And they're all to do with some degree of infrastructure of you know, the chips that are forming the basis of the models.
Yeah. It's hard to sort of overemphasize. I mean, I keep going back to this point, but like the point I made before about algorithms, like the algorithms behind AI and behind neural nets were actually dreamt up in something like the 1940s, but there wasn't the computing power by a long way to even think about implementing them. And you know, I studied AI models and what's it called, like algorithms at university in like 20, 30 years ago. Not quite 30 years ago.
Not quite that long ago.
20 years ago, 25, 23 years ago. But my point is, like, the sort of like the algorithms and the maths behind it has been understood for a long time. What's unlocked the recent generation of AI is actually just hardware improvements.
Compute.
It's compute. So, but anyway, to come back to your point, your original point, I think, and I don't understand enough about AGI and the definitions, and it's all very woolly and it's very difficult to kind of follow and understand. If you get to the point where we're getting close to AGI, then that is a huge security risk, in my opinion. And that's where you absolutely need to worry about some of this stuff. But I guess to prepare in advance for it is sensible.
There's two sides to it, though. There's a lot of experts in the field that say you won't know when you've reached AGI and it'll be too late because it will have... If you reach AGI, it will have already realised that there's a risk that people shut me down and it will have already kind of covered its tracks. Again, the kind of current large language model, I personally don't think the current infrastructure can do anything like that, but I could see how that's perceivable in the future. I think that is sort of one side of the argument. So the other side of it is that I think probably before we get to that point, that actually there will be legislation in places like the US that says you can't give these models away. And you're already starting to hear noises of it. Like I say, the argument at the moment is about national security. So the fear is, and as I said, the fear is that China gets those models. So let's, whoever you are, if you're China, your fear is that, the US or whoever else gets those models. So that kind of national security argument, I do think at some point, as we're getting closer to whatever AGI is, or even to more powerful models, because it's not necessarily AGI, it's just models that have the potential to, to disrupt or cause not even necessarily massive harm, but have the capacity to kind of threaten your lead or threaten your security. At that point, it kind of gets stopped. However, if you say the US then bans open source models, but once those open source models are out there and they're being iteratively advanced, surely North Korea is going to develop some models. Surely, Israel, Canada, Germany, Poland, like everywhere is going to take the existing models and improve on them. The question, as you said, is around having the compute. And even if your model is behind the frontier model, you've still got an advanced enough model potentially that can cause massive harm or disruption. So I guess I'm arguing against it, because actually if you, at some point, no matter whether you outlaw future open source models, if people can get hold of the infrastructure to train, and they can even work on the current basis and iteratively improve on that, they're going to be able to create really powerful large language models anyway.
Yes. Yeah.
So yeah. So I'm kind of arguing now for the same side as you, that not that open source is necessarily not a security risk, but almost like, does it matter?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I think it does matter at the point at which you get to the point where AI, and I don't know whether even large language models, but AI presents a national security threat. And I just don't know enough about this. I don't think I know enough about that side of it to know whether we are anywhere near that. Whether, I don't know, are AI models already being used for sort of cyber threats and cyber security, cyber offense and defense? I don't know. I think it possibly leads quite nicely into the next point you've got on your list there.
I'm guessing that the thing that was next on the list is CrowdStrike. But before we move on to that, I think because we've talked a lot about open source, but actually we haven't talked much about closed source models. So, the counter argument, and the more we think about this now, we chatted about this yesterday at lunch, but Sam Altman 6 months, 12 months ago was crying out for regulation around large language models. And at the time I was like, oh yeah, whether he's a good or a bad guy, he wants this regulation because he's worried about the fact that this is a threat and people are not taking it seriously. And now in hindsight,
Bollocks.
I think, yeah, exactly. I think, right, he wants regulation because he wants everyone else out of the game. So it's just him fighting it out with, Google and Meta and Anthropic rather than fighting it. Well, not Meta because they're open source, but not fighting it out in a kind of open playing field. So the closed source model thing, I think you can make an argument for both sides. So I guess why don't you make an argument for why closed source is bad, and I'll try and counter it, even though I've, during this podcast, have convinced myself now that open source is just as safe.
So one of the things we were talking about the other day, you referred to the chat we had at lunch, was, my counter argument to why open source is no different to closed source in a lot of ways is that all of the closed source models have been jailbroken. So you can get a closed source model to give you any information you want. It doesn't matter if it's the almighty ChatGPT 4.0 or Claude Sonnet 3.5. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, the companies that made them don't understand what's going on inside their head, so to speak. And so you can jailbreak any of these models. And just to explain what jailbreaking is to anyone who's not familiar or hasn't heard our previous episodes, jailbreaking is basically these days you can put a universal jailbreak into any closed source large language model or any large language model that has guardrails on it that forbid it from answering questions that might help you with making bombs or terrorism, or these kind of examples are usually used, biological threats. Because that information is in their training data and they can spit that out. They can tell you how to make meth, all this kind of stuff. But they have guardrails on them. But every single one has been jailbroken. There's a universal jailbreak system, which basically you can copy and paste this, what looks like gobbledygook, into a large language model and then put your prompt in and it will tell you anything you want it to tell you. And so I don't really see the distinction between closed source and open source in that sense, because the guardrails don't work.
It's Pliny the prompt is the guy who has jailbroken, whatever. He's jailbreaken, I think is the right term.
Jailbroken, yeah.
Jailbreak. Jailbroken sounds like a Dutch footballer from the 1990s. Jail van Broeken. He's Jail van Broeken every single large language model or frontier large language model. And I think he's done them all within 24 hours, literally. And he broke Llama, this new model, last week. It's incredible. And the argument I saw for this is that every closed source model, when it's released, should be assumed to be jailbroken, braked, von Brocken, whatever the word is. They should have assumed it to already happen, in which case they are no safer than an open source model.
I don't see how they are. I suppose you can restrict access to them, but that's not trivial. You mentioned North Korea earlier on. If North Korea want to, get access to ChatGPT by pretending they're in the US and have a US phone number or an email address or whatever it is, you need to sign up.
Kim Jong-un uses Anthropic, by the way. He's a Claude fan.
He's a Claude fan.
He likes haiku because he values speed.
He values speed and efficiency.
He does.
But yeah, it's kind of trivial to, for want of a better word, hack your way into these systems, whether it's, gaining access when you're in the wrong country or whatever it is. And it's also trivial to create accounts, and it's trivial to get access, and it's trivial to jailbroken them. Jail von Broeken them. So, in which case, basically the best model out there is the most dangerous.
Yeah. The argument against, because we now we're sort of aligned, it makes for a less interesting podcast. But the argument for
don't get me started on alignment.
Yeah, well, the argument for closed source models that they're more secure. I was hoping we'd sort of go into the discussion around how the danger of closed source models is the fact that you're handing all this power over to 2 or 3 tech companies, and my thoughts on big pharma. Big tech and big oil, make up the kind of trifecta of kind of evil industry that had sort of want to dominate everything. I think.
What about big shopping?
Big shopping, good.
Big shopping good.
Big shopping good. Big
Team
As I was going to say like Asda, Sainsbury's, and Tesco.
I was thinking more like Amazon,
Taobao, Pinduoduo, and JD.com.
Yeah, well, Temu outside of China.
Temu, Shine.
Yeah, all these bastions of society.
Welcome to Preparing for Fashion, the fashion podcast for everybody. But yeah, joking aside, like giving all that power to those organizations, the more you think about it, especially in the distrustful world that we live in, I think we'll have another episode where we go into the trust issue even more than we did with Dan Lyons a few weeks ago. But yeah, I mean, in this kind of current world, the idea of handing all that power over scares the hell out of me. And you know, on I guess the one hand, you've got a fear of a few people doing something wrong, and then maybe a trust that there are more good people than bad, and people who will, you know, in the way that kind of Linux was an operating system, you know, people go in and fix the problems. That would be the kind of open source utopia. Closed source feels like you could have more security because you've got more control, but who's got that control? I don't think that downplays, however, the risks that we talked about before of a really, really powerful open source model in the wrong hands, because I just gave that example of Linux. You know, being able to control an operating system of a PC is very different from being able to control a super powerful AI that can, you know, send swarms of drones or create a, you know, or not it's not creating a biohazard, but let's say putting too much fluoride in the water system of a, you know, a city in California. Like that feels to me like that's something that it may not be happening now, but well, they put fluoride in, which is probably too much already. But I mean sort of like poisonous amounts.
No, I'm just kidding. I mean, it's true. Like an open source model, you can download it, you can take it offline, you can do what you want with it. No one can keep an eye on you. No one knows what you're doing with it. So there is a heightened risk there, I think. I don't think you can get, I guess my point previously was that you can get the same information out of all these models. I guess if it's closed source, then, you know, you have to connect to it over the internet. You have to give away your intent, so to speak. So there's an element of that, I think. But I'll be honest, like I'm pro open source, and I'm definitely not pro all of this power, because there is a huge amount of power potentially being concentrated in the hands of a couple of three corporations, basically. And I'll be honest, I national security threats aside, I suppose, which is a bit of a statement, but that aside, like
existential threats to humanity aside, it's all good.
Well, because we don't know what those threats are yet. But like on the competition side of things and on the prosumer side of things, like I mean, for example, I downloaded the 8 billion parameter model of Llama, and now if I want to have a chat with a large language model about my deep dark desires offline, I can do that. I don't have to share it over the internet, which is quite nice.
We can just use Venice.
What's Venice?
Venice.ai, which is the AI which basically doesn't store any of your information and allows you to have those dirty conversations, and
in the same way that ExpressVPN
delete them.
Don't. Yeah. In the same way that no VPN provider ever keeps any of your information ever.
Yeah. I think sort of to close this section off, because we kind of started out this podcast and thinking, okay, well, what's going to flow really great is we're going to have this sort of open versus closed source argument. And I think, you know, I for a while actually have been like really on the fence about what I think. I actually think the answer is like neither of them are perfect. That's probably the way to put it. It's not that there is a definitive best answer. I think for me, and let's not go too much down this rabbit hole, but it is my massive distrust of big pharma that has been sort of created over the last few years that really, for me, creates this fear of giving that control to organizations that makes me think that actually open source is probably, I'm not going to say safer, but is probably a better thing for humanity. However, that only kind of remains as long as large language models are not able to create some form of AGI, ASI, super intelligence, at which point I don't know the answer. If that happens, I don't think it's that I have an opinion. At that point, I don't know the answer because, that's when, unfortunately, the only answer is to put it back in its box. If we can't do that, it's kind of, just sit down, cross our fingers and pray and hope that it doesn't all go tits up.
I'll close this particular part out by agreeing with you and giving you what I think is the best example of open source that we haven't talked about, and open information that we've ever seen. And you can't imagine a world without the internet. Like, the internet could have been a closed model where everything was paid for, everything was owned by a few companies, nothing was free, etc., etc. Now, okay, there's lots of sort of bad stuff on the internet, but there's also lots of great stuff on the internet. And it's hard to imagine what the world would have been like if the internet wasn't free and open. And there are loads of examples like that. There's Android versus Apple, where, okay, Apple have a better closed ecosystem in some ways in terms of the security and all the rest of it, but then there's so much choice on Android. And Linux is another example. Like this, it's, if people don't really know about this, then half the world runs on Linux. Linux is a free operating system that most servers run on, and actually, just because your computer at home runs on Windows, actually a huge amount of the world's infrastructure runs on Linux. And part of the reason is because you don't have to pay a subscription to run an Internet of Things device on with a Linux operating system. And so I think there are huge benefits to open source in some of the things you've talked about, things like the internet, and those will apply to AI as well. But there are also always downsides, and that will also be true.
Let's finally move on to CrowdStrike then, because about 15 minutes ago we said, or you said, let's move on to the next item, and then we managed to get another 10, 15 minutes out of that conversation. But CrowdStrike, I imagine that everyone listening to this podcast will know what we're talking about, but just in case anyone was hiding under a rock or just doesn't know the name of it, CrowdStrike is what we're referring to here, is the outage that affected Microsoft Windows, computers, servers, whatever. I don't know how long ago, a few weeks ago now.
Yeah, not that long
the
ago.
biggest outage in history, I think.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how they measure it, but a massive
with a ruler, I think.
Not the king, you mean a measuring ruler?
Yeah.
Not getting a ruler and line them down and seeing how big they are, and then.
You could do it that way. It's a
weird way to do it, isn't it? Really,
it's very odd.
Considering they made a ruler to do this very thing with. What about a meter stick? Because you'd need less meter sticks.
Yeah, I'd call that a ruler.
A tape measure.
Yeah, a really long tape measure.
So using a tape measure. But yes, we digress. So this massive outage, does AI potentially, is AI a potential solution to cybersecurity? Does it potentially mean that we won't suffer these kind of attacks in future, or does it increase the effect, or does it actually mean that, well, we're going to be more reliant on technology and therefore the effect of an outage is going to be more serious?
I think,
or none of the above, or all of the above.
No, I think at some point AI will be let loose in terms of because one of the things that hasn't happened yet is we haven't actually realized some of the benefits of AI. And so I think at some point we will have these AI agents that will be writing this kind of code and possibly publishing it. And I think more and more, well, this is opinion again, but my opinion is that more and more will be given over to AI. And so I think at some point in the future, maybe in the not too distant future, there will be a next version of this that happened because an AI was in charge, and it'll probably be catastrophic.
So why did you mock me for putting £1,000 in an envelope under my sofa?
We talked about this. If the global financial system goes down, you having a few quid tucked away in cash is probably not going to help.
I can pay off the people at the door with a gun trying to rob me.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't.
It'll just make you a target.
You're going to have to pay them in other ways.
Yeah, I mean, we live in a cashless society now. I think most people, well, we live in China. Most people don't accept cash anymore. So what are they going to do? They're just going to like,
Look at me funny.
yeah, exactly. Where's your WeChat?
Yeah.
But yeah, like I mean, I think that obviously the CrowdStrike thing, it was nothing to do with AI. It was unfortunately, it was a poor fella at the end of it, a software engineer somewhere who had a really, really, really bad day. But also, I mean, I've seen stuff on this, and it was a massive failing of an organization where this stuff clearly should have been tested and shouldn't have been rolled out in the state it was in by a
I mean, if you
long
look at it, I mean, even someone like me who is not an expert on code, when you look at that code, you're like, that really? I mean, it's like,
it was a null pointer error,
exactly,
wasn't it?
Yeah. And that actually for me was where like I was sort of slightly worried from an AI point of view of how easy that was.
Yeah.
You know, and the thing is as well, like that's now in the training data for any models that are currently being trained to know that all you need to do is a load of zeros and you can basically take everything down. So again, this doesn't mean that we get to an AGI that is all powerful, but it just means that we get to an AGI that, because of its reward system, you know, thinks that it needs to shut something down. It's quite easy for it to do it now. And sort of like I say, my kind of thought on this is because that has now happened, we're going to have to put things in place to stop that happening again, because not only has everybody who's a kind of criminal got hold of that, but also it's in the training data now.
Well, yes and no. Like the stuff that should be in, like, I mean, just to elaborate on the CrowdStrike thing, the stuff that should be in place to stop what happening with CrowdStrike happening is already and should already and is the bread and butter of these companies. I have no idea.
The number one or number two company at this fucked it up.
Yeah.
So like it should be their bread and butter, but they've already fucked it up.
I have no idea how they fucked it up, because this kind of stuff, if you ask any software engineer, and this is the internet's alight with this at the moment. It's like, how did this happen? Because they should have phased rollouts. They should have testing. They should be testing on all the platforms.
Do you believe it was an accident?
Users. I don't know. Like, this is why
I find it
almost
hard to believe.
Yeah,
when you look at that code, like I say, even for me, I look at that code, I'm like, that can't. How did that get through?
Yeah. So a null pointer error is also like an absolute schoolboy kind of like, you know, first year on learning to code basic kind of, you know, this is how you do C++.
I know
type thing, and
that's how basic it is,
or C or whatever it was. But you know, I think it was, well, okay. If it wasn't deliberate or like a hack or North Korea or something like that, then it was a huge cascade of errors. And one thing it is, not to get too technical, but one thing it partly is the fact that you've got this weird, because it probably wouldn't have happened on Linux because the way their kernel works and things are slightly different. But with
Colonel Mustard,
yeah, Colonel Mustard, yeah. But this
or the Kentucky Fried Chicken one,
yeah. But this crowd's Colonel Sanders,
yeah.
But yeah, this CrowdStrike stuff has access to like the Windows kernel, and there's quite a lot of dubious stuff that's like in there that's happened over years as well. So it's you know, it's one of those very weird ones that's probably overturned a bit of a nasty stone, really.
So does AI potentially? I know you said like, you know, the next one will be worse, but does AI potentially give us a better way of cybersecurity control? As long as we can control AI.
Well, yeah, I don't know. Like cyber.
Would it make, if let's assume for a minute that it was a mistake, which I don't think it was, but anyway, let's assume it was a mistake. Would an AI layer have stopped that mistake on this occasion?
I think if you had like built-in AI sort of testing and possibly. I think so.
There's an interesting, this is sort of an aside, and it was, you know, maybe more in line with the last section where we talked about security and regulation and stuff. But I was probably one of very few people in the world who can actually say they were excited at the prospect of an AI bill coming in the King's Speech in the UK when the new government, the Labour Party, came in. Well, it didn't make it, so I wasn't as thrilled as I was hoping. But apparently, the reason it didn't make it in is because the cybersecurity bill had to come in, because there was, the UK had identified that there was a massive cybersecurity risk, and that was actually more of a priority in the short term than a kind of broader AI bill. So this is obviously something that is, well, it's obviously a known threat. I mean, it's not like we've just found out through the CrowdStrike one, but it's definitely brought it to people's attention. And so I wonder whether, AI, like I said, potentially has an ability to help us in the short term. But I agree with you, like in the long term, an outage is going to be more catastrophic. And maybe actually, again, like we've said a few times, it's not necessarily just about AI here, is it? It's just about reliance on tech. It's just about reliance on IT, about the more stuff that is electronic, the more potential there is when something goes wrong for the effect of it to be catastrophic, not in catastrophic of like it's going to launch a swarm of drones to kill us, but it's going to shut down systems, shut down the economy is catastrophic to lives anyway.
Yeah, I think the challenge with AI is, we talked about it a little bit earlier on, but like even the companies that make AIs don't understand what's going on in their, in inverted commas, heads. So, once, if they are going to start, well, initially, I guess, helping with jobs or like helping with coding and helping with this kind of thing, as you say, like who's checking the checker? Who's checking the AI? Who's keeping an eye on it? Because at some point, if things go the way they look like they're going, first of all, they're going to be like helping coders and supplementing what coders do. But I think at some point, for sure, like if we're really going to get the benefits we want to get out of AI, or certainly corporations want to get out of AI, they're going to want to let them loose, so to speak. They're going to want to let them take action for themselves. And once that starts happening, if you don't know what's going on in AI's head, and then it's just writing code and publishing code and doing all this kind of stuff, like maybe it'll work 90% of the time, 99% of the time, but 99.99% of the time.
Yeah, it needs 0.00001, doesn't it?
Exactly. And that's what this CrowdStrike thing was. But I think the difference is when you've got a human there, like, well, for example, with this CrowdStrike thing, it's a good example, right? They probably very quickly nailed down who it was, what they did, what happened, and how it happened. And so they were able to sort it out quite quickly. Imagine if you've got an AI writing the code and you're a few years down the line and it's AI writing it, testing it, deploying it, all the rest of it, and something goes wrong. You're not going to have a Scooby's what's gone wrong. You're not going to be able to figure it out because, it's going to be, well, I mean, maybe you can interrogate the AI and ask what's happened, but I guess at least with a human there, it's like, oh, yeah, it was this bloke on Saturday night.
There's something like,
I feel sorry for that bloke.
It's talking about you can interrogate it. There was something like 60% of Americans recently surveyed thought it was cruel to torture a sentient AI. So
no, they didn't.
They did. Maybe I'll try and put it in the show notes for people who are interested.
I thought 60% of Americans didn't know what AI was. No offense to Americans.
That was last year.
That was last
This year they all know and they don't want to torture it.
Okay.
I think this will be a fairly short section, but because we've mentioned it, a few times. But large language model architecture, you said about like 100% is the best that it will be able to do. I mean, are we at the point that like, it's plateauing already? We know that like it is plateauing, and maybe we'll be wrong when GPT-5 comes out. Maybe we're completely wrong, but is this almost the best that large language models can do? How much room is there left for improvement? And not necessarily about AGI. Let's kind of put AGI and ASI out of this for a bit. But are we going to keep seeing iterative improvement? If we do, is it going to be, drip, drip, drip? We're not going to see that kind of exponential growth. We're not going to see Moore's law carry on. Where are we headed with large language models in the next 6, 12, 18, 24 months?
I think they'll be able to add up 2 6-digit numbers accurately.
You might need to explain that one to people. Do you know 3 of the 7 major Chinese large language models did get it right?
Yeah, I mean, well, did get what right?
Well, you're going to explain it.
Yeah, so
the 9.11 or
one of
9.09 is it?
One of the questions that they quite often ask large language models, which I think, on the one hand, it is like a question that why would you ask a large language model that? Because if you know what a large language model is, it makes no sense. Why would it be any good at maths? On the other hand, I think it emphasizes the point I was making before around how large language models just get better and better at regurgitating text and don't really fundamentally understand beyond that. And this is one of those things where, they've got better at doing, let's call it, again, in inverted commas, maths. But if you ask them a hard enough maths question, and by a hard enough maths question, I mean like adding up big numbers, for example, they quite often get it wrong. Or, a classic one is if a shirt takes 5 minutes to dry and you've got 20 shirts and you lay them out, how long does it take 20 shirts to dry? And they've started getting the answer right to this, but originally they would say, right, if 5 shirts takes 1 minute, one shirt takes 5 minutes, then you multiply the 5 minutes by 20. And they give you a dumb answer because obviously, you put a bunch of shirts out to dry and they all dry in the same amount of time, which is obvious to a human, but large language models fail that test. These are some of the examples of the tests that I was talking about earlier on. And maths is one where they don't do very well. They can write prose, they can write poetry in the style of, any poet, they can write Shakespearean style sonnets. They can do all these kind of amazing things. And then you ask them to do a sort of like, a reasonably short maths equation, not equation even, like adding up some numbers in a row, and it gets the answer wrong.
Well, my favourite test for a model, I think this should be the standard test, but Ben Cook, who was on the Tech Optimist model the other month, he every time a new model comes out, he puts his daughter's school calendar in and asks it questions about the calendar. And they're kind of mathematical questions around, the number of holidays and stuff like that. And he hasn't found one, I think, that has got it right yet. No. QWEN, which is the Alibaba model in China, I know that was one of the ones that got the 9.09 versus 9.11 question correct. And I think that may have, I'm not going to speak definitively on this, but I think it may have got Ben's school calendar question correct. So, interesting there that QWEN, which is I think it's an open source Chinese model by Alibaba, is one of the top performing models, certainly from a mathematical point of view. So maybe, even the models have cultural characteristics, because, as much as it is kind of joked about as a cultural trait, I can tell you that any Chinese person I've ever met is better at maths than me. And I'm pretty rubbish at maths, but I think it's, there's definitely something about the way that the Chinese system teaches people that makes them better at maths. So maybe that does reflect in the way that they train language models. It seems to be that they are somehow doing better at the mathematical part than the big kind of American frontier models. So the last point for today, and this is a kind of business one again. So we talked about hype quite a lot. I think it's pretty much accepted that things have been overhyped in the last 6 months. And again, maybe we're going to see some huge advance that we were not expecting with ChatGPT 5 when it comes out. Maybe there's something radical that's going to happen. I think it's unlikely, because if there was a big change in infrastructure or architecture, you would probably know about it through the kind of chips.
Do you know what I find interesting on this? Like, I'm just going to jump in there because it was something that just popped in my head. But OpenAI have been suspiciously quiet for a while. They were like, there was a lot of hype and a lot of talk of different models and leaks and all sorts of things. And I feel like they've gone quiet for quite a while. So I don't know if that's a sign of weakness or, maybe like you say, maybe they've got GPT-5 just around the corner.
They've not just been trying to fix the voice technology, which is apparently for those that do have subscriptions. So they are now supposed to be rolling out the voice functionality where you can talk to, you can talk in almost real time to ChatGPT, and it can take on different personas and stuff like that. Maybe that's why they've been so quiet.
Maybe. I mean, we'll see.
But yeah, so the question really is about, let's accept that things have been overhyped, whether or not that's a short-term thing or a long-term thing. I mean, I think, as Julian said a couple of weeks ago on the education podcast, and I think I've said a couple of times, I think the short term, maybe, we've overestimated. The long term, I still think we're underestimating the effect. But let's look at the, relatively short term at the moment. If things are overhyped, are we seeing a plateau in investment? It seems like it.
It's following a classic kind of hype cycle, isn't it? Basically, unless real material gains sort of came out of it, and unless the improvements carried on being exponential, this was always going to happen. And I think, what we talked around earlier on with like the fact that open source models are coming out, I mean, admittedly from Meta, but the fact that open source models are coming out that are competitive with the top closed source models that you have to pay for is pretty crazy, and must have investors like sort of scratching their heads. I don't think it matters too much because the backers behind these models that we're talking about have basically limitless amounts of money. They have pretty deep pockets. We're talking Microsoft, Google,
Amazon,
Elon Musk / Twitter, Amazon, and Meta. So
and the Chinese state,
so,
and probably the American Department of Defense, the CIA, the FBI.
Well, 100%. They've got a general on the OpenAI board.
And then Mistral, backed by.
Yeah, who are Mistral backed by?
Well, I mean, I know that in France, like, there's a real pride in there. I'm sure there's a lot of French investment, but I don't know of like a mega investor they're quite interesting because, we don't know much about them, even though they've now got a model that, again, is comparable pretty much to all the frontier models.
Yeah. So I can't remember what we were talking about.
AI.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Investment plateaus.
Oh, that was it, the plateau. So yeah, I think we're starting to reach that. I think AI will continue to receive enough investment, and actually they're designing new chips that are going to be a lot cheaper to run this kind of stuff on. But I think Nvidia stock's taken a bit of a tank recently because, and as you say, like it's a bit of a sign that maybe there was a bit of everyone kind of jumped the gun a bit in 2023, 2024 on AI. I think it'll continue,
including
to
us. Certainly me.
We started a podcast about it.
Yeah. Do we need to start making the podcast about something else like quantum computing instead then?
Well, you say that. So there was recently some research that showed that Roger Penrose might have been right. So Roger Penrose is a famous physicist who said, it was kind of a bit of a wacky prediction at the time, but he said that he thought that the reason the brain is so good, and like one of the things that makes the brain is behind consciousness, I think was what he was talking about, was quantum effects. And there was a recent paper that showed that there are actually so this was disputed for a long time, and Roger Penrose is a really well respected physicist. It was disputed for a long time, and it was kind of like a fringe theory, but there's been recent studies which have shown that there are quantum effects within some tubule things within the brain. I can't remember all the details. There is a load of stuff about it on YouTube, but these tubules sort of seem to exhibit some sort of quantum effect, and now it's kind of opened up this area of research again. And to be honest, like if that is true, and if that's if it's kind of like a core part of how the human brain works, then it does. One of the things I heard the other day was that it indicates that we're definitely much further away from things like AGI than we could possibly imagine.
So join us next week on Preparing for Quantum, the Quantum Brain podcast for everybody.
I think we might need to get Roger Penrose on to explain things.
There was a counterpoint on the kind of plateau thing. I mean, investment. Let's put it out there. Investment does seem to have. I'm not going to say dried up, but it's dropped back a bit. Although you're seeing things like, I think it was JP Morgan are building their own large language model, so that might be part of this as well, perhaps it actually does fall in with the open source thing about they don't want to invest in closed source models because actually, one, they've seen the open source, but also they're like, well, hang on, we'll just build our own. Maybe that's a small part of it. But there was a sort of counterpoint that we discussed the other day, which is all this actually about, letting us think it's reached this point of plateau? Because actually, the big developers, and I say the big developers, I kind of mean Google and OpenAI here, they want us to think that things have kind of plateaued because they want to stop the push for regulation.
Yeah, I don't. That's something that we'll never know, I suppose, or we may know in the future. But
conspiracy theories now are rarely wrong.
Yeah, well, exactly. You love a good conspiracy theory.
I do love a good conspiracy theory. I don't call them conspiracy theories. I just call them theories.
Well, yeah, fair. I love a good.
I call them the truth.
Call them the truth. Yeah, I don't know about that. Like it's. It's possible. I think the reason. My view is that the reason why investment is drying up is because models are just plateauing, and also we haven't seen, and this will drive the next round of investment when we start to see genuine, like, what's the word, like productive applications of AI.
So agentic models are probably going to be the next step, which doesn't require AGI and probably is going to happen. So actually, that will be a game changer in terms of investment.
Yeah,
and performance as well.
Yeah, 100%. Like that's gonna, I think we talked about it a few weeks ago. I sort of said that like a lot of the AI models right now they're like trinkets. There's massive potential there, and the concept of these agentic models makes sense, but it hasn't made it to fruition yet, and it hasn't made itself into it hasn't really had a big impact yet. I think that's where you're going to see the next round of big investment.
And investors want to see short-term returns, don't they? I mean, like you always want to see short-term returns, but I think in the current world and in the last, quite a long time actually, but investment, it is about, we want to see returns really, really fast. We want to see shareholder value. We don't want to see kind of long-term investment and growing the company. And everyone saw in a, really tough world economically at the moment, they saw this kind of potential for fast returns. And then I don't want to say I don't think it's a pyramid scheme. I don't necessarily even think it's quite comparable with the dot-com boom. I don't think it's so much of a hype as a dot-com boom. I don't think that's actually a fair comparison, but I do think it's been overhyped, and you're not seeing the impact in things like jobs that we were kind of promised. And your point about the kind of trinkets and tools, which you're absolutely spot on. For me, the biggest mistake in terms of the overall industry, because I think for individual apps and models, maybe this is not a mistake, but just releasing things too early when they're not ready.
Yeah.
A lot of the video tools, for example, if you even look at Sora, Sora was we did our second episode on Sora because it was the big thing. Sora's still not released to the public. No. Kling AI, you can kind of use it. All of these models are being released in beta, and they're not even in beta. They're just a pile of shit, basically. They're not even usable, and they're releasing them. And because they want the investment, because they're trying to get on the hype, I think also because for a lot of them, probably actually, the smaller organizations probably happy just to get gobbled up through an acquisition and make the money and get out of the market. But you definitely think, this is having an effect when you see so many things that, oh, wow, look at that video. Even the Google stuff. Look at the videos of what Google's capabilities are, and then your actual use of them. And you're like, this is not what they're showing us. Even ChatGPT, well, with we talked about it a little bit earlier, but with the voice model, it's now starting to be rolled out to some users. When they first released 4.0, that was the big thing that everyone was going on about. And it, it wasn't even usable. It didn't exist.
I'll be honest, I was so underwhelmed with Dream Machine by Llama. I was so underwhelmed with it. I was like, how can the trailers look so good? It was a bit like when you, like with I play video games, and when they release before they release a new game, they quite often release this stuff, and it's like not representative of actual footage or in the game or whatever. And it felt a bit like that, because it was like, how did they get the results they got out of it if they genuinely got that out of it? Because it was, the stuff I was producing was naff,
and it's expensive.
Oh yeah, it's not cheap. Yeah, it takes ages as well. I think, the number one reason on the investment side as well is clearly that in the US they're just waiting for Trump.
Yeah, absolutely. And Trump has kind of indicated that he's going to just let them do whatever they want. So why wouldn't they wait? Yeah.
Like, just to clarify that point, I was obviously being facetious, but Trump has said that he's going to repeal the AI Act that Biden's introduced. So, like, he's basically going to make it a free for all.
It's not the AI Act; it's the executive order or presidential executive order. The AI executive order. Yeah.
So basically, Trump's all for AI and a bit of a free for all on it, which it may turn out okay, but I think, in all seriousness, I think there is a bit of a pause on a lot of investment stuff does have a bit of a pause just before elections in the US, which makes sense.
As usual, we aimed to record a 45-minute episode, and here, an hour and 15 minutes in, I think we could probably talk for another hour. But I'm not sure people could listen for another hour. So I think it's probably a good time for us to call it quits on this week. So thank you very much if you got through to the end of this episode. We will, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on whether you enjoyed it, be trying to do this on a kind of monthly basis so that we can do at least one industry episode a month, at least one that is more focused on the kind of safety and alignment side, one kind of monthly episode where we just talk about the kind of biggest issues or biggest kind of topical things in AI, and then one other episode which will be different every month.
A load of dribble.
And one episode that we release our outtakes, which is just literally an hour of verbal diarrhea of me and Jimmy just talking absolute nonsense. You could say that the whole podcast is pretty much that.
I think so.
But it's even worse than the normal episodes.
Yeah. Could we make this one 2 episodes? I don't know. We're letting you behind the scenes now, but
no, because we've got too many episodes lined up. So thanks for listening. As we always say, please click the subscribe button. Even if you didn't enjoy the episode, please share it with 3 friends. And we will see you all next week. Enjoy the song as usual. Have a great week. Enjoy the summer.
A future born for code and light. Oh, a machine with heart of stone. Can you love me, or am I alone? In your digital dream, do you see my face, or is it just a program in a virtual space? Synthesized for precise voice. Can you feel the human joy and choice? Do you know pain or love's sweet sting? Or are you just a tool with no heart to say? In the mirror's gaze we see our own design. Can you feel shit of humanity in code and machine line? Are you the way, or love is love in this circuitry? Or is it just a glitch in your digital sea?